You know, I've been observing the developments in Washington lately, and I must say it's quite a situation. I generally make it a point to steer clear of the political arena. That's just not my field. My focus is on business, on balance sheets, on understanding the fundamentals of a company. But when you start to see events that directly impact the market, that shake investor confidence, and that threaten the very architecture of our financial system, well, you can't simply ignore it, Doc. So, I'd like to discuss something that has been weighing on me. Donald Trump, having returned to the presidency in 2025, finds himself in a predicament far more severe than the public seems to grasp. I'm not talking about the kind of transient trouble that a news cycle washes away or a strong speech can mend. No, this is foundational trouble, legal, financial, and structural, the kind that permeates every aspect of governance. Many people assume that following the 2024 election victory, Mr. Trump's various legal challenges would simply dissolve, fading away like a morning mist. The exact opposite has occurred. The opposite. And that reality should be a source of concern for every American, regardless of their vote. This is no longer about one individual. It's about the integrity of our institutions, the nature of trust, and the capacity of our system to function under such profound stress. Let me outline the actual circumstances. Because I'm not convinced people fully appreciate the gravity of this, Mr. Trump is currently navigating what may be recorded as one of the most intricate legal webs ever to entangle an American president. I am not being hyperbolic. This has moved beyond partisan bickering and into the core of our judicial and financial regulatory frameworks, the very systems designed to keep our economy orderly. In February 2024, prior to his inauguration, a New York judge held Mr. Trump and his organization liable for significant financial misrepresentation, specifically inflating the value of his properties. Why is this important? Because when you overstate property values, it's not just harmless puffery. It's a manipulation of the financial ecosystem. It allows you to secure loans on terms you don't deserve and insurance rates that defy reality. It is, by definition, fraud. The court levied a penalty of $354.8 million, which, with accruing interest, swelled to nearly $454 million. While an appellate court in August 2025 did void that specific monetary penalty as excessive, the crucial detail everyone misses is this: the underlying finding of fraud was left undisturbed. It stands. What is the practical result? The Trump Organization is now operating under state-mandated monitoring. Court-appointed financial overseers are scrutinizing every transaction, substantially limiting Mr. Trump's capacity to manage his own real estate holdings. Consider that the sitting President of the United States is restricted from fully controlling his own company because a court of law does not trust him to act without committing fraud. This is an extraordinary situation for any business person, let alone a head of state. It forces us to confront questions we have never faced as a nation. I want to be precise here. This is not a political critique. It is an economic and systemic one. When this degree of legal entanglement exists at the highest level of government, it generates profound uncertainty. And if there is one thing markets despise, it is uncertainty. When I analyze a company, I scrutinize its governance. I assess management's integrity. I ask, can these people be trusted with investors' money? If I see a history of financial manipulation, inflated figures, or court oversight, that is a red flag as large as this country. You do not allocate capital to such an enterprise. Now, apply that same fundamental logic to the nation. If global investors, bondholders, and anyone directing capital toward the United States begins to perceive a structural rot at the top, it impacts everything: interest rates, the value of our currency, and the flow of investment. That is my concern. Not the politics, but the stability. Mr. Trump's dilemma has transcended partisan warfare. This is the judicial branch, attempting to perform its function, colliding directly with the reality that its subject is the most powerful man in the world. This generates an immense structural tension. And when tension like that builds, cracks appear. Maybe not immediately, but over time, institutions are forced to bend in ways they were never designed to. And things that bend too far, well, they often break. I have seen scandals, market collapses, and profound political turmoil. But this is distinct because it is all converging at the top with tangible financial repercussions and institutional strain. The monitoring of the Trump Organization is not a minor bureaucratic detail. These are overseers with the power to veto transactions and demand disclosures. For a man who has defined himself as a master dealmaker, this must be a source of immense frustration. But from a systemic view, it is deemed necessary because the risk of further manipulation was judged to be too high. This leaves us in uncharted waters. We are faced with a combination of escalating legal jeopardy, policy disputes arising from these conflicts, and market reactions that are far more volatile than our underlying economic health should warrant. This is why I'm speaking out, something I am historically reluctant to do on political matters. This issue, however, is no longer just political. It is about the fundamental workings of our economy and whether we can maintain stability when the center is not holding. I don't have a simple solution. But I know this. Trouble of this magnitude does not simply vanish. It must be navigated methodically, with institutions permitted to do their work impartially. This will require time. We all need to be prepared for a very long and difficult period. Asterisk now, let's discuss Georgia. If the New York civil fraud case is serious, and it is, what is unfolding in Georgia is in another category entirely. These are criminal allegations. These are charges that carry the potential for a prison sentence for a former and current president. Mr. Trump is facing accusations under the RICO Act, the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This statute was conceived to dismantle organized crime, the mafia, cartels. It is a formidable legal tool because it allows prosecutors to target an entire pattern of criminal conduct, not just isolated incidents. When a RICO charge is brought, the state is alleging this was a coordinated criminal enterprise. The allegation? That Mr. Trump and his associates formed a conspiracy to unlawfully subvert the 2020 election results in Georgia, pressuring everyone from election workers to the Secretary of State. This is a high-level felony. A conviction, and I stress if, as all are innocent until proven guilty, could result in a sentence of up to 20 years. For a man in his late 70s, that is effectively a life sentence. This case is not just against Mr. Trump. He has 18 co-defendants. The evidence is reportedly vast, built on phone records, digital trails, and recorded conversations, including the call where Mr. Trump asked state officials to find the specific number of votes he needed. From an investor standpoint, and I am always an investor, RICO case with 18 co-defendants and extensive documentation tells you prosecutors believe their case is formidable. They do not bring these charges on a whim. But what concerns me even more are the political ramifications. A conviction could potentially disqualify Mr. Trump from holding public office in certain states. This strikes at the very heart of our governance. We are entering a legal and constitutional thicket, unlike any in our history. Georgia is not the end of it. Mr. Trump is simultaneously entangled in two major federal investigations. The first relates to the handling of classified government documents found at his Mar-a-Lago residence. The allegations, unauthorized retention of defense information, obstruction, are, factually speaking, quite direct. The documents were there. The second federal case concerns election interference at the national level, focusing on the alternate elector schemes. This involves charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States. His legal team is, of course, fighting vigorously with delays, appeals, and procedural challenges. That is their function in our adversarial system. But this leads to a critical point. This all costs a staggering amount of money. Campaign finance disclosures show that entities supporting Mr. Trump's legal defense have spent over $100 million since 2023. And that number is climbing. When I see a company burn $100 million on legal fees, I see an immense drain on capital that could have been used for productive purposes. In this case, it's $100 million not spent on political operations or campaigning. Legal defense is an economic black hole. Partner-level attorneys command $1,500 or $2,000 an hour. Multiply that across multiple state and federal cases, and you reach $100 million very quickly. But it's not just the money. It's the bandwidth. It's the focus. When you are fighting multiple, existential legal battles, your attention is consumed. It is not on policy, governance, or the complex work of the presidency. This creates instability. Markets require clear, focused leadership. When the leadership is distracted by the threat of prison, decision-making becomes reactive. Good governance, like good management, demands a steady hand and a long-term view. It is difficult to see how anyone could maintain that focus while facing 20 years in Georgia, federal indictments, and a $100 million legal bill. That is what worries me most, the cumulative effect of this chaos on our ability to govern. If these legal issues were purely personal, it would be one thing. But we are now seeing wholesale institutional resistance across the government. I mean, the courts, federal agencies, and state governments are all pushing back. Let's look at the specifics. Within Mr. Trump's own administration, major policy initiatives on immigration, trade, and deregulation are under judicial review. In November 2025, a federal judge in Oregon, for example, blocked an order to deploy National Guard troops for riot control, ruling it unconstitutional. This is not an isolated incident. Courts nationwide have halted or delayed numerous executive directives, citing constitutional overreach. Here is a figure from Just Security, a watchdog group. The Trump administration is currently battling over 500 active legal challenges. Of those, roughly 30 executive orders have been fully blocked, and over 250 are in legal limbo, awaiting final decisions. I have lived through many administrations, and this level of judicial confrontation is, by all accounts, unparalleled since the 1970s. The courts are not just disagreeing on policy. They are saying the administration is breaking the procedural and constitutional rules. Imagine trying to run a business where 500 of your decisions were tied up in litigation. You couldn't execute a strategy. You couldn't plan. That is the state of our government. But here is where it truly hits home for ordinary Americans. In November 2025, the Supreme Court permitted the administration to block $4 billion in federal SNAP funds, food stamps, impacting nearly 42 million low-income Americans. The administration cited a budgetary crisis. I understand fiscal discipline. I've built a career on the efficient allocation of capital. But economists are warning that this move will not only deepen food insecurity, it will reduce consumer spending. That $4 billion is not just aid. It's economic stimulus. It flows to grocery stores, to farmers, to local businesses. When you remove it, you create a negative ripple effect that harms entire communities. Then there is the push for a universal 10% tariff on imported goods. I have been skeptical of tariffs my whole life. A tariff is just a tax. And it's not paid by foreign countries. It is paid by American consumers. You and I pay it. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates this could cost the average American household an additional $1,500 per year. Worse, these tariffs are straining relations with our key partners, China, Mexico, the EU. They are not just accepting this. They are retaliating. They are putting tariffs on American-made goods. That means our farmers and manufacturers lose sales. I have always believed trade is a positive-sum game. This policy assumes it is a zero-sum game, which is simply not how the modern global economy functions. So, we have 42 million people facing food cuts, a $1,500 tax on the average family from tariffs, strained trade relations, and 500 legal challenges creating a fog of policy uncertainty. This is the systemic trouble I am talking about. And it is all happening at once. The question isn't if we're heading for a crisis. We are in one. The question is how severe the breakage will be. Asterisk, you might be asking why I'm suddenly speaking out on these matters. You are correct. I typically avoid politics. My job is to allocate capital and think about long-term economic value, not to be a commentator. But a time comes when silence is a form of complicity. A time comes when economic policy deviates so far from sound principles that one has a duty to speak. Not as a partisan, but as someone who has studied for over 70 years how economies build or destroy wealth. At the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting in May 2025, I told our 40,000 shareholders something I do not say lightly. These steep tariffs are an economic act of self-harm. Those were my words. Trade should be a bridge, not a wall. When you close yourself off, you are the one who pays the price. Your consumers pay more. Your businesses lose access to materials, and your exporters are punished by retaliation. It is economic suicide masquerading as nationalism. I am not the only voice. The World Bank and the IMF are warning that these barriers could shave 1.5% off global GDP growth. That's $1.5 trillion in lost output. Millions of jobs and innovation that never happens. My concern extends beyond tariffs. In my 2025 shareholder letter, I emphasized the critical importance of dollar stability and fiscal discipline. I wrote, reckless monetary policy can destroy even the strongest nation's savings. This is not hyperbole. It is history. When a government prints and borrows without restraint, it inevitably debases its currency. People lose faith. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is not a guarantee. It is a privilege that is earned through responsible stewardship. Yet we are testing the limits of that stewardship. At Berkshire, we have paid $101 billion in taxes over our history, including $27 billion in 2024 alone. I mention this not to brag, but to illustrate that corporate responsibility is essential for national stability. That revenue funds our government. But what concerns me is the administration's proposed $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan, which relies almost entirely on deficit financing. We are borrowing $1.5 trillion that we do not have. The CBO projects this path will swell our national debt from $34 trillion to $38 trillion by 2028. That's $1 trillion in new debt every year. This creates inflationary pressure, and more dangerously, it undermines investor confidence. Foreign nations who buy our debt must trust that we are solvent. When our debt explodes, they will demand higher interest rates to compensate for the risk. This creates a vicious cycle. I have not used Mr. Trump's name in my public letters, but everyone understands the context. I am not trying to score political points. I am trying to speak honestly about economic reality. You cannot run a country like a highly leveraged real estate portfolio. In business, you can declare bankruptcy and walk away. You cannot bankrupt a nation without inflicting genuine human misery. Pensioners who cannot eat, families who lose their homes. That is why I'm speaking up. Not out of political animus, but because I have studied history, and the trajectory I see is one of wealth destruction. The combination of trade recklessness, fiscal abandon, and legal chaos is a perfect storm for economic uncertainty. Asterisk, you can debate political theory all day, but the market is the ultimate arbiter. The market does not care about spin. It cares about reality. And the market is telling us something. Following the mid-2025 announcement of expanded tariffs, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 3.7% in a single session. That one-day drop erased $1.2 trillion in market capitalization. That is not an abstract number. That is the retirement savings and pension funds of millions of hardworking Americans, vanishing because of policy ambiguity. Markets can price in bad news. They cannot price in uncertainty. When investors don't know the rules, they pull back. They sell. They move to cash dot, and it's not just domestic investors. Foreign investment in U.S. Treasury bonds fell by nearly 6% in the third quarter of 2025, according to the Treasury's own data. That is not normal volatility. That is a statement. That is foreign capital saying, we are getting nervous. Once the perception shifts that U.S. debt is no longer risk-free, things can unravel with terrifying speed. My remarks in 2025 have simply mirrored this growing unease. What we are witnessing is a collision between political power and institutional accountability. It's a test of whether our checks and balances can withstand this pressure. My response is rooted in the principles I've held for 70 years. Financial discipline, free trade, and steady governance. These are not radical ideas. They are simply what works. Mr. Trump's confrontational approach to law and economics violates all three. While he remains a powerful political force, his mounting legal exposure, the policy backlash, and the economic turbulence he is generating have created a level of uncertainty not seen in this country since the 1970s. Watergate, stagflation, the oil shock, I remember that time. I remember the feeling of a rudderless economy. I am getting that same feeling now. The $1.2 trillion market loss and the 6% drop in foreign treasury holdings are just the early warning shots. They are indicators of a potential loss of confidence that could cascade. Asterisk, so, as 2025 concludes, I am reflecting on our position, and it appears far more fragile than the public realizes. When you are in the eye of the storm, it's easy to assume he will survive this, just as he has survived before. But that misses the point. His legal entanglements are metastasizing. You cannot govern a nation while fighting 500 legal battles. His policies are meeting resistance, not just from opponents, but from the institutions of government themselves. His economic strategies are being condemned by the world's most respected financial voices. My commentary is just a reflection of this reality. Markets respond to trust, stability, and transparency. And all three of these pillars are crumbling. Trust is eroding under the weight of fraud judgments. Stability is vanishing in a sea of legal chaos. Transparency is impossible when a president's business requires court-appointed monitors. If Mr. Trump cannot restore these pillars, his greatest threat will not be a prosecutor. It will not be Congress. His greatest challenge will be the gradual, systemic erosion of global confidence in America's economic leadership. The Senate, however, is the true barrier. The effort is likely to halt there. Republicans will frame it as a partisan attack and an attempt to nullify an election. Democrats, in contrast, will argue it is about accountability and the defense of democratic norms. But as with all hyperpolarizing events in our time, the narrative will shatter. Each side will energize its base, and the wider public will be left to navigate the ambiguity. The nation, already fractured, will likely see those divisions deepen. Public opinion will not move decisively. As for the 25th Amendment, it will likely recede from discussion. The political price is simply too high, and the legal precedent too untested. Cabinet secretaries will calculate the personal risk to their reputations and careers, and most will determine that action is not survivable. In capital markets, this is reputational risk aversion. In politics, it manifests as a kind of strategic paralysis, where everyone can see the approaching danger, but no one is willing to be the first to step out of the way. The very fact that these conversations are occurring in the halls of power, in the media, and in our homes is itself a critical signal. It means that decision makers, including those within the administration, have concluded that the current situation is untenable. In my experience, when insiders begin to voice alarm, it is rarely ideological. It stems from a structural discomfort with risk. In this instance, a risk that is not financial, but institutional. That fact should trouble every American, whether you track politics obsessively or try to avoid it. Systemic failure does not begin with a sudden collapse. It begins with silence, which then hardens into normalization. This is, fundamentally, a test of our entire constitutional architecture. Will the institutional guardrails hold when subjected to actual intense pressure? Not in theory, but in practice. Does the legislative branch still serve as a genuine check on power, or has partisanship neutered its resolve? Do cabinet officials serve as fiduciaries of the republic, or merely as loyalists to an individual? I have always maintained that pressure reveals character. This is also true of institutions. We are poised to learn if checks and balances is a functional reality or merely a phrase in a history book. This is not just a political spectacle. It is a stress test of the American experiment. The outcome will resonate far beyond this single presidency. If accountability is avoided now, we establish a new standard that future leaders of all parties will study, and not for the right reasons. When the abuse of power has no associated cost, the entire incentive structure of our democracy breaks. But if this episode results in genuine, measured consequences, it could reaffirm the principle that no individual, not even the president, is above the system. In the long term, that is the signal that markets, citizens, and democracies require to restore faith. When institutions begin to flex their constitutional muscles, it sends a message through the entire system to lawmakers, to businesses, and to everyday Americans. If impeachment degrades into just another partisan procedure, detached from principle, it loses the very deterrent power that is meant to safeguard the republic. Accountability is not about settling today's score. It is about ensuring the long-term viability of a system built on trust. If leaders, whether in the cabinet or among the electorate, choose silence, the repercussions will not just be political. They will be cultural. And as any investor knows, culture will always devour strategy. This situation is dynamic. We may see more individuals inside the administration choose to speak out, driven either by conscience or by self-preservation. New documents may appear. Timelines may change. Even party loyalty has its breaking point when reputational risk becomes existential. Sometimes the price of silence exceeds the price of dissent, but we must also be realistic. There is a significant possibility that the entire apparatus stalls, and in doing so, it rewards the defiance. This is the paradox of political inertia. It often strengthens the very thing it fails to address. What matters is not just who prevails in the moment, but whether the nation derives any learning from the experience. Whatever happens, this will be a case study for generations about leadership, institutional fortitude, and the democratic response to internal stress. These are not merely volatile times. They are definitive ones. History tends to assign immense weight to the decisions made in such moments. We are not just observing this story. We are all participants. Whether we are managing capital, running a business, or raising a family, the integrity of our democratic framework dictates the environment for all of us. That is why this matters. That is why I'm paying such close attention. The immediate future rests on a delicate balance of political will and constitutional obligation. While the House may have the votes to move the articles forward, the real conflict will be fought in the court of public opinion and in the quiet hallways where loyalty is tested. The allegations are no longer about one incident, but about a cumulative pattern of conduct that defies the very mechanisms of oversight. This is not simply a political crisis. It is a diagnostic test of the Republic's immune system. The question is whether our democratic antibodies' oversight, legal consequence, and institutional resistance are strong enough to overcome a sustained assault on their authority. The simultaneous discussion of impeachment and the 25th Amendment shows a system frantically checking every tool in its box. This multi-front response confirms the perceived severity of the threat. It is the sign of a constitution that is alive, but it is also a sign of one that is under profound distress. The markets have always known that uncertainty is the greatest foe of investment. Likewise, in governance, ambiguity about the rules of engagement destroys the foundational trust a stable nation requires. The coming days will be an education in real-time political risk. Watch not just the public declarations and votes, but the resignations, the anonymous leaks from inside, and the subtle changes in terminology from key institutional figures. Those are the leading indicators of systemic shifts. The burden of history is now on a very small number of people, lawmakers, cabinet secretaries, and senior advisors. They must determine if their ultimate allegiance is to a person or to the office and the constitutional order. Their decisions, made under intense pressure, will become part of the permanent record, defining the template for managing future crises of legitimacy. The cost of acting is high, but the cost of inaction, the normalization of this behavior, and the precedent it would create may be catastrophically higher, potentially reshaping the very nature of the American presidency for generations. This is not about one individual. It is about the system that must outlast him. It is about whether we, as a nation, still subscribe to the safeguards our founders established, or whether we have decided those safeguards are optional when they are politically inconvenient. In my investing career, I have always said that the most vital quality is temperament, not intellect. The same is true for a democracy. Do we possess the national temperament to enforce accountability when it is difficult, when it is unpopular, and when it divides us? That is the examination. And we are all being graded. Listen, in my 94 years, I have weathered significant political storms. I have seen crises that felt apocalyptic. I have watched the system bend and crack, but in the end, it held. This instance strikes me as unique. It is not because the dangers are novel, but because the very mechanisms designed to contain them are being stressed in unprecedented ways. What we do now, what our leaders do, will not just define this presidency. It will define the office of the presidency itself for decades. That is a profound burden, but it is also a sacred duty. We are custodians of these institutions, not their owners. We are meant to protect them and pass them on. If we fail in that duty, the cost will not be political. It will be generational. So remain vigilant, stay informed, and do not forget, in any system, indifference is an action, and often it is the one with the highest long-term cost. Thank you.